Welcome to our basement, Colorado. I'm Philip Stead, and I would like to thank Craig Knox, who is on the other end of the camera today, and my buddy Robert Meyer, who you will see and hear running trains in the backdrop. This is an On3 narrow gauge, O-gauge layout. It's 30 by 50, thus 1,500 square feet. I am modeling Colorado-New Mexico border, 1949. And for several reasons. In 49, railroading in Colorado looked much like it did when the first train ran September 27, 1825 in England. But everything was bigger, of course, 120 some years later. But also in 1949, when you could look back and see the history of railroading, you could also look forward 20 or 40 years. The Burlington Zephyr was introduced, bringing stainless steel cars and high-speed diesel locomotives to trains. The Rio Grande had been using the same yard for a long time, and they built a brand new one in 49. So again, we had diesels and modern trains that are much more similar to what we have running today. So I like that perspective of the late 40s, being able to look back and forward. The particular date I chose was September 27th, and that's pretty finicky, I understand. But September is the prettiest time in the part of the country we model. And the first train that I mentioned in 1825 ran on September 27th. So I combined the two to get the beautiful gold trees of Colorado and in 1949. What else can I tell you? The main line is 300 feet long in a 1,500 square foot basement, which I mentioned. The layout goes around the walls of this 30 by 50 basement, and there are 3 interior peninsulas. But when it's all said and done, it's one long continuous loop. There is, at the left or west end of Chama, there's a short 2.5 foot vertical wall that divides Chama, the beginning of the layout, from Alamosa, the end of the layout, which is 64 miles. Now it's actually closer to 90 some miles apart. So that main line continues through the wall when we want to run exhibit trains or just watch trains run. But in any kind of an op situation, we're running from Chama as a beginning and end of the layout to Alamosa 96 miles later, again back to that same wall. Here comes the train up the 4% grade. The layout is laid out around the basement in the same order that the towns and scenic locations occur on the railroad. So I've modeled about 30 different scenes here in the basement, and they are strung together like a string of pearls in the appropriate order. So everything you look at is my attempt to model in miniature. Everything follows a real scene. We started out in Chama a few minutes ago. We left Chama headed northbound, crossed the Double River Bridge at Chama, and then we hit the base of the 4% grade that climbs up to the summit. And that 4% grade surrounds me at this point here. We're coming through an area called the Narrows, and now we are approaching Lobato Trestle, which is a sheep loading point. And from Lobato Trestle, we will advance, continuing east and up, and we're going to go over the Lobato Trestle, which is the first major scenic highlight on the railroad, in my opinion. This trestle was constructed by Steve Austin from scratch, and it is magnificent. I've never seen any other attempt to model this particular trestle. So, climbing towards Cumbres Pass on the 4%. One of the things I failed to mention at the beginning, and this is very important, is that this is not a one-man railroad. I've had help from close to 40 people over the past 13 years. Some have contributed as little as a scratch-built outhouse. Others have spent literally weeks and months at their home building beautiful structures, which eventually ended up on the layout. So this is my basement, this is my dream, but what you're seeing is the fruit of dozens of people. We have we came up the Lobato Trestle a minute ago. We came through the town of Dalton. Now we're at the town of Cresco, and there's a waterfall and a water tank here. And the waterfall scene is reminiscent of many of the scenes around the layout. It was constructed primarily by three people. Steve Austin did the rock work. Morris Smith did the waterfall, and John Coker did the trees. So again, I'd love to take credit for this scene, but those three gentlemen put this together, and I am thrilled with it, as I am with the balance of the railroad. We started out in Chama at 42 inches off the floor elevation. We've progressed now up a 4% grade to 54 inches, and we're now again on a 4% grade that will take us to 66 inches. So we gain 2 feet as we go around the basement in an attempt to portray going from the valley of Chama to the mountaintop of Cumbres at 10,015 feet elevation. This is Windy Point. This is another famous spot on the railroad. Photographers will walk out on this ledge and shoot the train going by. Okay, at this point, trains headed east will now be headed downgrade. We climbed to Cumbres, and now we're going down to the town of Alamosa. The grade is slightly less here than the 4% we were on. Tanglefoot curve is a 270-degree turn that the engineers used to lose a lot of elevation in a fairly small area. There's not much up here, some cows and a lot of snow and a great deal of wind. It's a quiet, remote, isolated spot and a lovely place to observe a train curving back almost upon itself. This is Ozier, Colorado. You can see we're higher now because the first snow of the fall is on the ground. My wife Linda, who has done 300 feet of backdrop, had said she would like to try a winter scene, so she came up with the idea of the swirling clouds. So this is first snowfall, Ozier, Colorado. And as I said before, we try and model the buildings, the structures, and the overall scene like the real thing. Well, every now and then we make an exception. This covered roundhouse here came down in 1927, but it is too neat a structure not to include on the model. So Alan Mole made this from scratch. And there's a turntable inside. Okay, leaving Ozier, Colorado, entering the Toltec Scenic area. Again, you can see the first snow of winter on the rocks. Also of note is the Garfield Monument. Trains from 1880, passenger trains from 1880 to 1951, stopped there both ways for 5 minutes so that the passengers could get off and look over this cliff down at the river more than 1,000 feet below them. So pretty spectacular stop. There are 2 tunnels on the prototype railroad, the first being this one, Toltec Tunnel. It is solid rock, no reinforcing needed. When you exit Toltec Tunnel, you go not very far, and there's a second tunnel called Mud Tunnel. And Mud Tunnel was dug into a very loosely composed mountain and had to be timber framed to keep the rock off the railroad. So 1 rock and 1 mud tunnel. Okay, this is Sublet, New Mexico, a remote section house. And its claim to fame seemed to be, from talking with several people, that most any time anybody stopped at Sublet, they saw a rattlesnake. They apparently were everywhere. People find this transition interesting. To the left of this divider is the high, dry desert, and a quarter of an inch later, you're 10 miles further east into the populated town of Antonito. Okay, this is the town of Antonito, Colorado. This is where we've left the high, dry desert of Colorado, and we've now entered the populated town of Antonito. This depot was built by a friend of mine named Matt Coleman, and it was his first scratch-built structure, and it is a beauty, including lighting and interior detail. Okay, this is eastern Antonito, and at this point, the train enters a 29-mile stretch of perfectly straight track. Unfortunately, because of the confines of the basement, I represent 29 miles in 29 feet. This is Alamosa, Colorado. This is the easternmost point that we attempt to model. This is where the narrow gauge that we've been following for the last 100 miles meets the standard gauge coming west from New York, Chicago, and Denver. You'll notice there are 3 rails. That's because the narrow gauge runs on the 2 tightest gauge rails, and the standard gauge runs on the 2 outside rails. And in fact, they share a 3rd rail. So you can tell by the small cars in front of you that are narrow gauge, you can see their relative size to the standard gauge version behind them. So Alamosa was very interesting, having both locomotives, cars, passenger cars, and cabooses of 2 different gauges and sizes running on the same rail. This is the Alamosa Depot Station. Alan Moll scratch built the Alamosa depot and freight house. Thank goodness the real structures still exist. He scratch built them, including the interior, and they are one fine pair of structures. Thank you, Alan. Okay, at the far east end of the layout is the standard gauge roundhouse, again scratch built by Matt Coleman, and behind it, straight ahead, is the pièce de résistance of the whole layout. This is a coal trestle built from Rio Grande plans, board by board, again by the very talented and generous Alan Moll. Okay, this is the very end of the layout with the locomotive passing by the future Gramps oil refinery. It's about to go through a wall, and this wall is not load bearing. The wall was put up strictly to divide Alamosa from the other side over here, which is back to Chama. So these 2 scenes, 4 inches apart, in fact represent the 2 ends of the layout, 100 miles apart from each other. I thank you again for coming. I thank you, Craig, for your camera work. I thank you, Robert, for running the trains. And I would like to compliment the NMRA Piedmont guys that came up with the idea of doing this year's tour by video rather than in person, that we cannot do because of the COVID. Linda and I have hosted 17 open houses with between 50 and 100 attendees, which I've always been humbled by. But as much as I have enjoyed people coming here, I've always felt bad for those that were either incapacitated and couldn't come, too old to drive, too young to drive, whatever the situation might be. And hopefully this year, 2 or 3 times as many people will be able to enjoy all of these railroads. So thank you, NMRA Piedmont Division.